Good afternoon, bonjour, Annie. I want to acknowledge that we're on the traditional land of many First Nations and recognize our Indigenous past, present, and future here in Ontario and in Canada. Je suis très honoré d'être avec vous aujourd'hui. Merci beaucoup. Prime Minister, welcome to Don Valley East. I'd also like to welcome our Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance, the Honourable Chrystia Freeland, and thank them both for being here. I'd also like to welcome everyone here, the local community. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for making time to be with the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister. Prime Minister, I believe this is your first official visit to Don Valley East, so I want to welcome you to Flemington Park and Don Valley East, the most vibrant, multicultural, diverse community, I believe, in all of Canada. More specifically, I want to introduce you and welcome you to the Resource Centre where we are today. This is where I first learned to swim. I spent countless hours in this gym playing basketball and floor hockey, and where I first started to use the public library. In fact, this was the place where I got one of my first jobs running the after-school program for kids here in Flemington Park. So for me, it lives up to its name as a local resource centre. We are proud of Don Valley East, home to the first planned community in Canada, Don Mills. And yes, we love our community, but Mr. Prime Minister, there are some big challenges that many of us face in this community. Over the last few years, like many other communities across this country, the pandemic was tough on families. And now, as the economy shifts and with higher inflation, affordability is becoming an even bigger challenge for many families. We are happy that you're here today to listen to the stories of local residents, to hear their concerns, and most of all, share some good news on how Canada and our government can help make life more affordable for people in our community as they take on some really big challenges. So, Prime Minister, thank you for being here, thank you for listening, and thank you most of all for having our backs. Mr. Prime Minister.
Hello, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. Thank you, Michael, for those words and for welcoming us here to your beautiful riding and to this extraordinary community centre that has turned out a lot of extraordinary young people, including yourself. And I also want to thank, obviously, Chrystia Freeland, our Finance Minister and Deputy Prime Minister, who's been at the forefront of making sure we're there with supports for Canadians who need it, making sure we continue to be responsible in our approach so that we can rely on our resources to support Canadians in times of trouble, and of course to build for a stronger future for the decades to come. We're here at the Dennis R. Timbrell Resource Centre. We had a chance to chat with families and seniors just a few minutes ago. I want to thank them all for joining us today. You are why we are here today, and I really appreciate your presence. Is global inflation caused by the pandemic and Putin's war is making things more expensive for people around the world and having a real impact on Canadians, too. People here, like Rami and Georgina, who have 2 kids, are worried about being able to pay their bills, and others are having a tough time paying rent or saving for retirement. We know that too many Canadians are dealing with the rising cost of living. We hear you, and we're there for you. The first thing we did when Parliament came back this fall was to introduce legislation to put more money in the pockets of the middle class and people who need it. That's why we're doubling the GST tax credit for 6 months for 11 million households, and those payments are landing in bank accounts across the country today. If you look at your bank balance today and you're one of the 11 million households that gets GST credits and returns, you should see help for you directly. It'll help you pay the bills. Couples with 2 kids will get up to $467 more, and seniors will get an average of $225 more. On double le crédit d'impôt pour la TPS pendant 6 mois pour 11 millions de foyers à travers le pays. Les paiements commencent aujourd'hui. Pour les familles de la classe moyenne et ceux qui en ont le plus besoin, ça veut dire plus d'argent dans vos poches pour aider à payer vos factures. Les couples avec 2 enfants vont recevoir jusqu'à 467 $ de plus. Et les aînés vont recevoir 225 $ de plus en moyenne. Yesterday, Chrystia presented the fall economic statement. This is our plan to make life more affordable and build an economy that works for all Canadians. Right now, we're seeing economies around the world slowing down. No matter how hard the slowdown hits, Canada is best placed to withstand it because of our responsible approach since the start of the pandemic, which keeps us resilient. In fact, just today, we saw that last month the Canadian economy added 108,000 jobs. The bottom line is this: our government will continue being there for you. We're moving forward with measures to help people pay their bills and create thousands more good, well-paying jobs. So, what does our plan mean for you in everyday terms? For small businesses, it means that our government is working to lower credit card fees. For families, we're working so everyone can afford to send their kids to the dentist. For students, we are permanently eliminating interest on Canada student loans and apprenticeship loans. For young people, we're moving forward with a new tax-free first home savings account that'll make it easier to save for a down payment. For low-paid workers, we're providing advance payments of the Canada Workers' Benefit to put more money in your pockets sooner. And for all Canadians, we're securing tens of thousands of good middle-class jobs to produce critical minerals and build electric vehicles and batteries while we fight climate change. On pose des gestes concrets pour aider les aînés, les familles, les jeunes. On poursuit notre travail pour bâtir une économie centrée sur le bien-être de tous les Canadiens. Conservative politicians, well, they'd like to cut things like the employment insurance and pensions Canadians have been contributing to for their entire working lives. They're actually doubling down on the failed old theory of trickle-down economics, which means tax breaks for the wealthy while hollowing out the middle class. And they think you can simply opt out of inflation by investing in volatile cryptocurrencies. Their approach is reckless and out of touch. Ours is all about responsible, steady leadership. We won't cut the programs so many Canadians rely on. Our government remains here to fight for you, for your success, for your future, for your kids. Pour tout le monde, merci beaucoup d'être ici. I'm now happy to turn it over to Chrystia Freeland.
Okay, I'm not quite as tall as the Prime Minister or as Michael. Bonjour tout le monde. Je suis vraiment heureuse d'être ici aujourd'hui en compagnie de notre Premier ministre et de mon cher collègue, Michael, qui est un excellent représentant et un fier représentant de Don Valley East. Et je tiens à remercier le personnel du 7 Resort Centre pour cet accueil vraiment chaleureux. And I do want to start by saying thank you so much to everyone who is giving up some time today to be here. And thank you especially for the wonderful conversation we had a moment ago. It was really inspiring for me. Michael said he is proud of Don Valley East because it is the most diverse community in Canada. I think there are other places that would fight for that title, and that's a great thing about our country. And just talking to all of you and hearing from you, hearing how proud you are of Canada, and hearing about your faith in our country and your contributions to our country, it's really inspiring for me, and it's a reminder for me of really how wonderful our country is. One person said we're fortunate to be Canadian. I really believe that. And just the time we spent together, it just reinforces my absolute confidence that no matter what the world throws at Canada and Canadians, we're going to get through it together. So, as you just heard from the Prime Minister, The key message of the fall economic statement that we tabled yesterday is making sure that we are there for Canadians. We are about to deliver hundreds of dollars in new support to low-income renters. We are delivering a multi-generational home renovation tax credit. That means that families across the country can now afford to have a grandparent or a parent or a family member with a disability move back in with you if they want to. We're permanently eliminating the interest on Canada student loans and Canada apprentice loans. Great news for our young people. We're enhancing the Canada Workers Benefit. This is for low-income workers, people who work really, really hard, but don't get paid that much money. And what we're doing now is changing that benefit so it's going to be paid quarterly and it's going to be paid in advance. I think that's going to make a lot of difference to some of the hardest working, most important people in our country. And, of course, as the Prime Minister mentioned, really great news today, which is that the GST credit payments have been going out this morning to 11 million Canadian households. That money is hitting your bank accounts or you're getting a check in the mail. That is real inflation relief that's going to make a real difference to the people who need it the most. And I just want to really assure everyone that our government is going to be there, come what may, to support Canada and Canadians during this global economic slowdown. And we can do that because we're being compassionate, we're supporting the people who need it the most, but we're also being careful and responsible. Canada has the very lowest deficit and debt to GDP ratio in the G7. And Moody's just yesterday, after we tabled our fall economic statement, reaffirmed our AAA credit rating with a stable outlook. That's the best you can get. You can't get a better financial report card than our government got yesterday. There are 513,000 more Canadians working today with a job than before COVID first hit. And our economy is nearly 103% the size it was before the pandemic. We have grown. And this year, Canada has the strongest economic growth in the G7. So what does that mean? What it means is, as the Prime Minister said, there is no country in the world better placed to weather the global economic slowdown than Canada is. And there is no country in the world better placed to thrive when that slowdown comes to an end. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you for the hard work you do every day. Thank you for the hard work you do raising your families. And thank you for being really so inspiring in the conversation we had earlier. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. We will now have time for questions from reporters. One question, one follow-up. Nous avons maintenant du temps de prendre des questions des médias. Une question et une question de suivi. First question.
Hi, it's Sean Benjamin from the CBC. Would you consider referring the use of the notwithstanding clause to the Supreme Court to get a better clarity on how it should be used?
As I've said, it is a very, very serious thing to suspend people's fundamental rights and freedoms. The proactive use of the notwithstanding clause is actually an attack on people's fundamental rights, and in this case is an attack on one of the most basic rights available, that of collective bargaining. That's why I spoke to union leaders this morning. That's why when I spoke with Premier Ford on Wednesday, I asked him not to invoke the notwithstanding clause preemptively, because suspending people's basic rights should never be something people enter into lightly or without seriously weighing the consequences. I think there are a lot of people, a lot of parents like me, who have kids in Ontario schools that are concerned about the job action and about the strikes. But I can tell you, all parents and all Canadians should be extremely worried about suspension of our most fundamental rights and freedoms. That's why, as I've said, the federal government is looking at all options, and we're considering what we can do to continue to be the government and the party that stands up for people's fundamental rights and freedoms, as we always have been. But it's also a moment for ordinary Canadians to stand up and say no to suspension of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, to suspension of their most fundamental rights. Okay. Ce n'est pas une petite chose de suspendre les droits fondamentaux des Canadiens. Particulièrement dans ce cas-ci, de suspendre le droit de négocier des conventions collectives, les droits des travailleurs de demander des meilleures conditions de travail. C'est un des fondements de notre démocratie et la Charte des droits et libertés au Canada garantit ces protections fondamentaux pour tous les Canadiens. Alors le choix de suspendre ces droits, de contourner ces droits fondamentaux, ne doit jamais être prise à la légère et ne doit seulement être utilisé que dans les circonstances les plus extrêmes. C'est ce que j'ai dit directement au Premier ministre Ford il y a quelques jours quand je lui ai parlé pour lui demander de ne pas utiliser la clause dérogatoire. J'ai parlé à des leaders syndicaux ce matin pour confirmer que nous allions être là pour défendre les droits fondamentaux des gens et nous regardons toutes nos options. Mais il faut aussi souligner que c'est à nous tous, en tant que Canadiens, de lever la voix haut et fort pour dire la Charte canadienne des droits et libertés qui nous protège tous est essentielle et ne doit pas être contournée. De défendre les droits fondamentaux, c'est à nous tous de faire ensemble. Le gouvernement va faire sa part, mais les citoyens doivent le faire aussi.
Follow-up question?
So StatsCan reported today that most wage gains are going to those at the top of the income spectrum, while those making under $20 an hour aren't seeing those raises. What do you have to say to Canadians who keep getting told that their wages are going to make inflation worse?
Canadians are facing tough times right now in paying the bills, in paying their rent, and paying for groceries, and paying for gas. We know that. That's why we're focused on putting forward targeted supports for the middle class, for people working hard to join it where they need it. The GST Credit check is arriving today in 11 million households' bank accounts across the country. 11 million households who need it are going to see hundreds of dollars to help them with the costs of everything right now. On top of that, we're moving forward to make dental care more affordable for families with kids who can't afford it. We're moving forward with extra support for low-income renters. In the fiscal update that Chrystia just presented yesterday, we're actually moving the Canada Workers' Benefit, which is targeted at those lowest income workers, to give them a top-up to their wages, to thank them for the jobs they do and to make it a little easier for them. Well, we're switching it so it comes earlier in the year so that they can have more money in their pockets as they're working hard, often in jobs that support us all. And at the same time, in this fiscal and economic statement, we're stepping up to say that big businesses, profitable companies, need to do their part as well by ending the free ride for share buybacks to ensure that profitable companies choose to reinvest in their workers, reinvest in the things they're doing in Canada instead of just giving profits to shareholders. These are the kinds of things we're doing to make sure that we're there to stick up for Canadians, but I'm happy to turn it to Chrystia to continue this answer.
Okay, well, Prime Minister has really said it already. The only thing that I'll add is, that StatsCan report is very consistent with data that we were seeing earlier. And when we thought about what we should do with inflation relief in this fall economic statement and previously, we did really look at the data. And what we saw is there are two groups of Canadians who are being hit the hardest, and that is low-income workers who are not seeing the same wage gains as higher-paid workers, and it's also young people. And you see that reality reflected in the measures we've put in place. So that's where you see the GST targeted at exactly those groups. As the Prime Minister said, Canada Worker Benefit targeted at exactly those groups. Rental, again, targeted at exactly those people. And then finally, saying that we're going to eliminate permanently federal interest payments on the Canada Student Loan and the Canada Apprentice Loan to give that extra bit of support to young people.
Thank you, Minister.
Next question.
Hi, Adrian Gabriel with CTV National News. Question for you, Mr. Prime Minister. We've heard you condemn the use of the notwithstanding clause by the government here in Ontario. We've previously heard you condemn the use of it by the Quebec government to suppress religious freedoms. There's many Canadians, though, who, with all due respect, say the time for lip service has passed and they'd like to see your government act. And they're wondering whether or not you and your government will commit to legislative change in the Charter to narrow the scope of the notwithstanding clause so that in the future it can no longer be used to impede on Canadians' freedoms and their rights.
I think the first thing to understand is that Canadians themselves should be extremely worried about the increased commonality of provincial governments using the notwithstanding clause preemptively to suspend their fundamental rights and freedoms. This is something that all Canadians who value the freedoms, the rights, the opportunities that Canada gives them and gives us all should be standing up to be very concerned about. And yes, this is the federal government that stands up for people's rights and freedoms, and we are absolutely looking at all different options. But it would be much better if, instead of the federal government having to weigh in and say, you really shouldn't do this, provincial governments, it should be Canadians saying, hold on a minute. You're suspending my right to collective bargaining. You're suspending fundamental rights and freedoms that are afforded to us in the Charter. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms cannot become a suggestion. It is something that has built Canada in fundamental ways by recognizing those foundational rights and freedoms that make us one of the best countries in the world. And the outrage we're seeing across the country right now at this latest use, building on top of previous uses that I have consistently condemned, I think is a moment for all Canadians to reflect and say, yeah, our fundamental rights are not to be, cancelled away by governments who want to get things done in the easiest and most efficient way possible at the cost of people's fundamental freedoms.
Okay, follow up.
Okay. Je pense que les Canadiens, d'un bout à l'autre de ce pays, reconnaissent à quel point nos droits et libertés fondamentaux sont essentiels, pas seulement pour nous en tant qu'individus, mais en tant que d'avoir un pays libre et ouvert et prospère comme on l'a. Alors oui, le gouvernement fédéral a certainement un rôle qu'on peut jouer pour regarder nos options, pour essayer d'intervenir avec ces provinces qui continuent de bafouer les droits fondamentaux des Canadiens, des citoyens. Mais je pense que le moment est venu aussi pour tous les Canadiens qui chérissent ces droits et libertés fondamentaux de se faire entendre et de rouspéter contre ces gouvernements qu'ils ont élus, mais qu'ils n'ont pas élus pour suspendre leurs droits, leurs libertés fondamentaux.
Follow-up?
A former member of your protective detail who helped organize the Freedom Convoy is reported to have leaked your schedule. Are you concerned about the safety of yourself, your family, given that it appears that people who are sympathetic to the Freedom Convoy and that work in law enforcement have been leaking your private information?
I think an awful lot of Canadians have been really made concerned by what testimony they're hearing this week at the Emergencies Act inquiry. The extent to which so many things were causing instability and difficulties for Canadians, security concerns for people across the country, economic impacts, direct impacts on residents in many parts of the country. These are things that Canadians remember from the convoy occupations. And this is part of why this inquiry into the use of the Emergencies Act, which is something that we invoked, is so important. I'm looking forward to my opportunity to share my perspectives at this inquiry, and it's really important for Canadians to understand what was going on in that moment and why it was the right thing to do to invoke the Emergencies Act in a responsible, time-limited, targeted way, because this was a situation that had all sorts of aspects to it that were and can be and are really concerning to many Canadians.
Okay, next question.
Hi, Prime Minister. Tyler Griffin, the Canadian Press. In June of 2020, as the pandemic was still in its early days, you were asked by a reporter how you would pay for the debt Canada was incurring to handle the economic shutdown caused by COVID-19. You said that interest rates were at historic lows and that because of that, going forward, debt servicing costs will be low. However, forecasts now suggest that debt servicing costs will more than double by 2026 compared with pre-COVID levels. Do you still think that debt servicing costs are low, and how are those rising costs to pay for all the debt we incurred during COVID going to affect Canada's fiscal picture and ability to pay for programs going forward?
I think it's really important to remember that Canada entered into the pandemic in the best fiscal position of almost all of our allies. And that allowed us to invest in supports for Canadians, whether it was for families, for workers, for seniors, for young people, whether it was for small businesses, for restaurants, for companies large and small across the country, to make sure that we could hold on through the pandemic and to make sure we'd come back as strongly as possible immediately afterwards. And that's what happened. Not only did we come out of the pandemic faster and better than many of our peers, the pandemic was less impactful on the health side in Canada than in many of our peer countries, and we came out of the pandemic with, again, the strongest fiscal position of all of our peer countries. And now, as we're poised and looking at the challenges that inflation is posing on Canadians, the challenges that a potential global slowdown will have on economies around the world, again, we have the best fiscal position of any country in the G7, the lowest deficit, and that allows us to do two things. It allows us, first of all, to be there directly to support families who need it now, families in the middle class, families working hard to join the middle class, who are needing that extra help now, with a GST credit check that's landing in bank accounts today, with help on dental, help on rental, more help that was announced in a targeted way in this fiscal economic statement, and at the same time, ensure that we have the ability to respond even further if things get worse in the global economy. We are on a responsible fiscal path. We are in strong positions to be able to help Canadians now, to help them if we need more help in the coming months, and with investments in things like clean hydrogen and more clean tech, build opportunities long into the future that will keep us as one of the highest rated economies in the world. But for a further comment, I'm happy to turn it over to Chrystia Freeland.
Yeah, thanks, Prime Minister. And I'm just going to touch on a couple of things the Prime Minister has mentioned. So the first is we need to be very clear that the emergency extraordinary spending by the federal government during COVID was necessary and it worked. You know, we heard from a lot of people here during the conversation how it made a real difference in the lives of Canadians who were in really difficult shape and who really needed the help. So it was the right, compassionate thing to do. It was also the economically smart thing to do. And when we tabled the numbers yesterday, a lot of people looked at them and they said, there is just a huge upside, a huge unpredicted upside to Canada's federal government revenues this year. And that's true, but that didn't happen by accident. Canada has the strongest growth in the G7 this year precisely because we invested in Canadians during COVID. We didn't let COVID destroy our economy. We didn't let COVID destroy our small businesses. We didn't let COVID destroy Canadian families. And so as a result, we really, as a country, as an economy, are able to come roaring back right now. And you see it in the revenues. You also see it in this extraordinary fact that there are 513,000 more jobs, more people working in Canada today than before COVID first hit. So, number one, the spending, it was the compassionate thing to do. It was also economically the smart thing to do, and the numbers show it. And then just secondly, you know, if your question is going to something that I think Canadians legitimately want to know, which is, okay, you spent a lot of money during COVID, but are we on a sustainable path? Are the government's finances after that spending still in good shape? And the answer is unequivocally, yes, absolutely they are. And they are because the economy has rebounded so strongly. They are because once the main COVID emergency was behind us, we moved to a really responsible fiscal path. As the Prime Minister said, lowest deficit in the G7, lowest debt to GDP ratio in the G7. And again, you know, the Prime Minister, Michael, and I, we're all politicians. You know, maybe you think we talk our own book a little bit, but you don't have to believe us. Believe Moody's, a ratings agency whose job is, you know, their primary job is assess fiscal sustainability of countries. That's what they're experts in. And that AAA rating with a stable outlook, what that says is Canada is definitely in a fiscally sustainable position, which means we can afford to be there to support Canadians no matter what the global economy throws at us.
Follow-up?
Prime Minister, many are saying that COP27 in Egypt is only going to be a success if an agreement is reached on loss and damage. What is Canada's position on loss and damage, and do countries like Canada owe reparations to countries that are least responsible for climate change and bearing the brunt of its impact?
Canada has always known the inherent unfairness of climate change, in that the people around the world least responsible for contributing to the emissions that cause climate change are the ones most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, whether it be extreme weather events or others. That's why Canada, from the very beginning, in COP19 in Paris where I attended, made a commitment on climate financing around the world, flow $2.6 billion in climate financing to support economies around the world, decarbonize and build resilient infrastructure against the impacts of climate change. Then, when I was in Glasgow just last Christmas at the last COP, we were there to continue to step up on Canada's development financing for climate with $5.6 billion, $5.2 billion to continue to help those most vulnerable around the world fight the impacts of climate change. So we are very much involved in all these conversations, and we'll continue to be involved in these conversations when we host Nature COP, COP 15, this December in Montreal. It'll be an opportunity to highlight everything that nature can do to contribute in the fight against climate change as we step up to protect biodiversity and nature around the world, and Canada, yet again, will be leading on that.
And dernière question, Radio-Canada.
Thank you.
Yannick Lepage, Radio-Canada. Concernant les possibles fuites d'un ancien membre de votre équipe de sécurité, est-ce que vous êtes inquiet et est-ce que de telles fuites peuvent nuire à la réputation du Canada auprès de ses alliés qui comptent sur notre discrétion?
On voyait à quel point les barricades illégaux du convoi l'hiver passé ont contribué à de l'inquiétude chez les Canadiens par rapport à notre pays de droit et le respect de tout ce qui se passe. On a vu à quel point les barricades de l'hiver passé étaient préoccupantes pour les Canadiens par rapport à l'instabilité, par rapport à l'impact sur les familles, par rapport à de grandes préoccupations auxquelles les gens faisaient face. Mais aussi, ça avait un impact à l'international, de voir qu'il y avait des gens qui étaient en train de déstabiliser l'économie et la vie des Canadiens. C'est pour ça que nous avions agi pour donner plus de ressources aux forces policières, pouvoir rétablir l'ordre. C'est important pour les Canadiens de voir toutes ces discussions, tous ces débats, comme on est en train de voir dans l'enquête sur les mesures d'urgence qui se déroulent actuellement. I think there were a lot of Canadians worried about the impact of these illegal occupations on their fellow citizens, on the Canadian economy, on Canada's reputation as a country of peace, order, and good government. Quite frankly, there were concerns expressed by international partners as well, seeing the illegal occupations of border crossings, of sites across the country. And these are all things that are coming to light during this important Emergencies Act inquiry.
Pour le suivi à la commission Rouleau, l'avocat des manifestants a prétendu cette semaine que les manifestants ont bénéficié de fuites de tous les corps policiers. Est-ce que la GRC et le SCRS devraient ouvrir une enquête pour déterminer l'origine de ces fuites?
Je sais qu'à tous les jours, il y a des nouvelles révélations de cette enquête publique et c'est exactement pour ça qu'on a amené cette enquête publique. C'est important pour les Canadiens de savoir exactement ce qui se passait. C'est important pour les Canadiens de comprendre les différentes forces qui étaient en train d'essayer de déstabiliser notre pays, nos citoyens, notre économie. Et c'est pour ça que je sais que tout le monde est en train de suivre attentivement et d'attendre avec éventuelle de la Commission.
Merci. Ceci met fin à la conférence presse. That concludes the press conference. Thank you.
Merci tout le monde.